have asked them to come in quietly, so hopefully they won't disturb us. Welcome, everybody. I'm Holly Arnolfi from the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. We're so pleased to see you all here today. As you may know, we've been running the festival online and hybrid for the past few years, and it's just so nice. We're all so overexcited, I think, to have everybody here. Welcome to our speakers. We've got, we're going to have our moderator, Maureen Tai, who works with the International Literary Festival. Emily St John Mandel, come over from Canada. Many of you, I expect, will have read a lot of her books. She's written 6 books. Her most famous, I suppose, are Station 11 and Glass Hotel, which was actually recommended by Obama, which I think is quite a commendation. And then we have Pico Iyer, who is a travel writer. He's written over 60 books? 16 books. Sorry, I'm terrible with numbers. I'm a literary person. But he is actually more than a travel writer, and if you haven't already, you really need to read some of his books because they are just beautiful lyrical works of art. And then we have Jim Hildebrandt, who is a big friend of the festival and an avid reader, and they're all going to share some of their favourite books with us today. I'm quite excited for this talk me and Maureen came up with because we just wanted to hear all their recommendations. And I'd just like to say, before I hand over to them, thank you so much to all our sponsors and the consulates that have helped to get the authors here, all our volunteers who do such a fantastic job helping us out. And there is a banner at the back which tells you about all of our wonderful sponsors and partners there. So thank you to them as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to Maureen. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much. Literary festival brings together writers, of course, but also readers. And since we have not 1, 2, but 3 amazing readers, I thought, why don't we bring them together and get them to recommend books that they've read and that you should too. So, first question though, before just to set the scene. Sorry about that. How did each of you become readers? Because people aren't born readers. Something happens to make you into readers. So I'd like to find out how you became readers, each of you.
With some difficulty, I have to say. I really struggled with reading as a child. My education was a little bit strange. I was raised by hippies on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. And I was homeschooled starting in kindergarten, which, when I say that in North America, usually people assume that there's some religious element to that decision. This was absolutely not the case. That was just kind of the back to the land thing that hippies were doing in the 80s on Vancouver Island. So I was kept home from school. I really struggled to learn how to read. And, you know, my family, they're book people. We never had any money, but we did have a lot of books and library cards. So there was definitely a culture of reading. I struggled to learn to read starting when I was 4 or 5. I didn't read very fluently until I was 8. And I remember a feeling, it was almost like a switch going off, of just struggling and struggling and struggling through incredibly boring primary readers. And then all of a sudden just understanding it. And so I went from the primary readers to Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, which I will never reread because I have these wonderful early childhood memories of the book that I don't want to be spoiled. Yeah, and then after that, I read constantly. I have no formal training as a writer, but I've been reading all my life, and that has been my education in many ways.
Interestingly, I think mine is almost the opposite story because I was the only child of 2 professors, so all we had in our little apartment was books. And then I compounded that predicament by spending, I grew up in England, 8 years studying nothing but literature, not a single hour of history or science or languages or sociology, nothing but Beowulf and Chaucer and then Beowulf and Milton and then Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So I almost feel I've spent 49 years just reading and writing to the exclusion of almost everything else. But, I mean, as you know, Maureen, for more than 30 years. My wife and I live in a tiny two-room apartment in suburban Nara. We don't have a car, I don't have a cell phone. We don't really have anything except time. And so every afternoon, to this day, I make a cup of tea and I gather some sweet Japanese tangerines and I go out to our tiny terrace and sit in the sun and read. Nearly always fiction, but occasionally the rigorous reportage. And when I come back in the room after an hour, I can feel I'm more nuanced, more attentive, more intimate. I'm a much better version of myself and a much kinder, I hope, friend to my wife or anybody I would meet. And it really shows me how just even an hour a day completely transforms the day and the person. And especially during the pandemic, when we were all missing our friends, I thought every day I get to talk to Milton and Melville and Emily Dickinson, and they're offering me the best company around. How could I ever, in some ways, wish for more?
Someone who doesn't dispense advice. You've done it again, Pico. Jim.
I grew up in a small city in Canada, St. Catharines, and my grandfather had migrated there from Ukraine and then Germany and lived in Western Canada. He was a writer, so the connections for reading were really from my mother's side. And our family were fairly avid readers, but I really was more focused on mathematics. And when I was around 13, my mother sent me to a literature course thing that was meant to be for, I guess, better achievers, although I'm not sure I was that. But I took this bus across town, and I shared that with another girl in my class, and her family owned Harlequin romances in Canada. And I thought that was quite impressive. And I said, well, I didn't think the books necessarily were impressive. And I asked her, well, do you read those books? Oh, no, we don't read those books. We just make money off those books so that we can read good literature. And I did learn during those long bus rides that there were really great books to read, and I started reading better books. And I think that all the books I've selected today I read as a teenager. I think although they look fairly white male as we go through them, that's what existed in the 60s. That's what existed in the 60s. I was a teenager in the 70s, but these books were written in the 60s. And they were, I think, books that changed literature in many ways. So that's why I picked those. But I did read them probably between the ages of 15 and 18 or so.
Well, we'll get into the book recommendations. We're going to do a quick questions session called Firsts. One-word answer. First book you remember reading, having read to you, or having read to you.
The first book I remember being read to me, I was so small, I have no idea what the title was. It was about a chicken, and I think her name was Emily. I was probably 4, but yeah, that's all the information I have. I'm sorry.
I grew up on Paddington Bear, another strange-looking, bewildered foreigner in middle-class England who arrived only a few months after I did. My first fan letter, I was just telling Holly, was to the author of Paddington Bear, who instantly sent back a letter stamped with a bear's paw at the bottom. So 60 years later, I'm indebted to him.
The first book I remember, I was at my grandparents' house and they read this German fairy tale book where there's really terrible things happen. They're really quite extreme. I do remember that.
Second question, because we're doing this in rule of 3. First book that made you cry.
I think it was The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, which I requested for Christmas when I was 14, and I just found it incredibly moving.
And that was the first book that shook me to the core, actually. I never forget reading it 31 years ago.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Amazing. I think the first book that made me cry was The End of the Raj Quartet by Paul Scott. It's a long slog, and at the end of about 1,900 pages, the payoff, though quiet, was devastating.
I don't know, maybe something by S. Byatt. I don't cry. I don't really cry in a lot of books. Maybe I'm reading the wrong books, probably.
Hopefully some of the recommendations here will do it for you. The last question about firsts. First book that you weren't supposed to read, but you snuck away and read anyway.
I was raised by hippies. You know, there were no books that I wasn't supposed to read. Yeah.
Stuck in a 15th century boarding school in England, D.H. Lawrence was my drug of choice, and instant liberation. There were no books I wasn't able to. Probably something like In Cold Blood or something that was pretty extreme at my time.
We'll go into the recommendations then of books you've read and why you should read them. And we'll start, I think, with Pico. Why don't you recommend a book that you think, that you've read, that you've loved, you think everybody here should read too?
Can I give a brief plug for the book that you're holding?
Oh,
which is,
of course.
Yes, I mean, some of you know this. The last time I was at the Hong Kong Festival, just before the pandemic, I met Jenny Orchard, a great friend of the festival, and she's put together this glorious book. She invited many writers to write about the book they most gratefully received or the book they most eagerly inflict on their friends. And one of the ones that I cited when she invited me to write was The Quiet American by Graham Greene. And many of you know that although it was set in Vietnam in the early 1950s, it describes the interplay of these three mighty empires, French, the American, and the Vietnamese. But at the same time, it tells this heartbreaking story of a love triangle of three people deeply attracted to one another, but each with his or her own intents. And it somehow interbraids this important, large public story with this rending, intimate, private story, all in fewer than 200 pages. And I always recommend it to anybody if she wants to know what's going to happen in Afghanistan next year, or what just happened in Iraq, even though it was published out of Vietnam in 1954. But I especially recommend it in a room such as this because we're in Asia, and probably most of you know those empires and maybe know Vietnam quite well. And when I think about it, one thing that strikes me is that Greene had just written the screenplay for the now celebrated Third Man movie at that time. And I think when he returned to his novelist's desk, he brought certain skills he had honed from being a screenwriter. He used dialogue as a form of action. He started the story at the end. And he employed this extraordinary compression and economy that he'd never had quite before. So being a screenwriter, I think, might have made him a better novelist. And I think finally, I'm not sure that any of the many places he visited got so deeply under his skin and into his soul as Vietnam.
My three books, I'll start a little chronologically. The first one was John Updike's Rabbit Run, and there's 4 in the Rabbit series. He wrote them every 10 years. So the first was around 1960, and Rabbit, which is a nickname of Harry Angstrom, the main character, gets 10 years older each book. And I roughly read them, 10 years apart. I just thought the character he developed is a small town in Pennsylvania. Is a star basketball player from high school. He married a girl in town whose father owned the car dealership there, and that comes up later in the book because he ends up taking over that car dealership in a second or third book. But in this first book, he already has one child, and his wife's pregnant with a second. His wife Janice, and he sort of has a panic attack, and he just drives away in his car. He drives south on small roads, and he comes to meet up with his basketball coach, who's dating, I think at the time, a younger woman, and he takes him out to meet another girl, and he just goes off with this girl for a while, like for a few weeks, maybe even months, and eventually comes back to his wife. But this story is just an escape story of the time. It's at the cusp of the 50s and the 60s and what is possible. And I think it's still reading the 4 books is still quite extraordinary. And John Updike is really amazing.
I think the book that I love most in the world, that I try to get everybody to read, is a novel called Sweet Française by Irene Nemirovsky. The subject matter of the book, it's about World War II in France. It opens with a Nazi invasion of Paris. She has this incredible gift for combining the political with the personal, where you get the incredible scale and scope of what's happening. But it's so personal. Her character development is incredible. And there's a kind of, what to me feels like perfection in the prose style, where it is so clear and lucid and beautiful and unfussy. I think part of what fascinates me about this book is the circumstances around it are possibly as extraordinary as the novel. Irene Nemirovsky was born around 1900 in Russia. Her family was very wealthy. They fled around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution when she was a teenager. They landed in France, when the Second World War broke out, she thought that having converted from Judaism to Catholicism would save her. Sweet Francaise was planned as a 5-part novel. She wrote the first 2 parts, longhand and pencil, tiny writing in a notebook. And then she was arrested by the Nazis in July 1942 and killed at Auschwitz a month later. She left behind 2 daughters. They were really young. I want to say like 5 and 8 or something like that. They spent the war being protected by their governess, moving around France. And they never looked at that notebook that their mother had left them until the 90s. When one of them had already died. The surviving daughter had never been able to bring herself to look at this notebook because she assumed it was a diary. And there was obviously a lot of pain for her in thinking about the last years of her mother's life. But then finally she decided to donate it to a museum. And she thought, well, before I do that, I need to transcribe it. So she set up a magnifying glass, to look at this tiny writing. It wasn't a diary. It was this incredible, violent masterpiece about the Nazi invasion of Paris. It was Sweet Francaise. So the novel wasn't published until, I believe, 2004. Like, it was really recent. It's just, so the circumstances around it are extraordinary. But it also, even if none of that story had happened surrounding the book, it's just an incredible novel. It's so beautifully and clearly written, and it moves me every time I think about it, let alone read it.
I think what we can see from the reading, how you've reacted to how you're recommending the books, is that you love reading. Why is reading so important to you? Why is it important to everyone?
I think for me personally, it goes to what Pico was talking about. It changes you as a person. I remember a line from an awards event that I attended years and years ago where the American author Neil Gaiman was delivering a speech. It was a homage to Ursula K. Le Guin, and he talked about the way that reading her had changed her as a person. And the line that stays with me is, she didn't make me a better reader, she made me a better person who reads books. And, it's kind of tricky because I have absolutely met some incredibly pompous, insufferable people who read a lot of books. And yet,
who are not here at the festival.
Who are not here. They're probably not even in Hong Kong. But
say that.
Yeah, well, but there is an opportunity in reading, I think, to expand the way you see and experience the world, to develop your empathy toward people who are absolutely nothing like you, with a completely different set of experiences. And, when I think about what reading meant to me during the past 3 years we've all been through, it was transport. We were so trapped. For me personally in New York City, where the official lockdown didn't last that long, but if you were sane, you weren't going to parties, or traveling very much if you didn't have to for work, which a lot of people did. But during the time when one felt trapped in one's apartment or one's neighborhood, reading was the way that you could leave. That was how I experienced it. So, it opens new worlds, and I think it can make you a more empathetic person.
Yeah, I mean, when I finished my 8 years of study in literature, I thought I'm only qualified now for unemployment. But later, I really realized spending all that time trying to read taught me how to try to read the world, how to read Hong Kong, how to try to understand the people around me. And just as Emily was saying, and I said this to you yesterday, I think reading more than music, painting, or film gets us into another soul and into another being as nothing else could do. And I think it's really an instruction in nuance, empathy, and if we can't read, I think it becomes much harder to navigate a world that's never actually going to live inside black and whites and block capitals. And if I can embarrass Emily a little bit, I love in Emily's novel Station 11, where there's this more or less apocalyptic virus, one of the few things that preserved at the other end is Shakespeare. And as you know, Maureen, we were talking yesterday, I was recently dealing with my mother, her body and her mind were falling apart in her late 80s. And I was thinking, how can I begin to deal with this most difficult of life situations? And I realized there wasn't going to be any simple book in the how-to section. in the bookshop that would help. There was no YouTube video that would tell me what to do. And I thought, King Lear, that's the one thing that I could go back to again and again, and everything about what it is to be old, what it is to be the child of somebody old, and what it is to lose somebody you care about is right there. You can never get more in a short space than that.
Jim, your bread and butter isn't writing, but you managed to incorporate reading into your life.
Right. I do read sort of 100 books a year or so. I think a lot of people, read 50 to 100 books. I do. It's so great that you can look at a year of books and you can pick 10 or 15 that are extraordinary, and it's very doable to read those in any case every year, which is fantastic. But I'd rather focus on when you're reading a book, and in our society now, we're doing everything in short form. So you're reading off a phone, or you're reading short paragraphs, or you're emailing, or you're doing SMSs. And the challenge is to put in your mind a set of characters and concentrate on them, and have them in your brain all day long, no matter what you're doing. A lot of people here are bankers or consultants or whatever you're doing. And they have to stay in your mind, and that's part of your brain that holds them all day long until you get back and are able to read again. And I think one of the challenges in society is to read for half an hour, 45 minutes, or an hour a day is what you need to do, I think, to probably be a good reader or get through what you want to get through. And but the beauty of it is actually the other 23 hours, or not maybe when you're sleeping, but when you're awake, that you still have those characters and you're still waiting to see what happens to them. And that is extremely special. And I would argue maybe more special when you have another job that's keeping you busy doing whatever we do, which is not that valuable, but the reading is valuable.
Great. We're just going to do quickly another 3 questions before we go into the second recommendation. Favorites. Favorite genre, Emily?
I absolutely will not pick one, but I respect the question, but I just love so many.
Pico?
Literary fiction, if that doesn't sound pretentious.
For me, it's probably literary science fiction, which I know is a strange category, but since Emily's here, she's almost in that category.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, sticking with you, Jim, first then. Favorite place to read? Favorite place to read?
Well, to read a physical book just outside, sitting in a chair in the fresh air, right the way it is in Hong Kong now, I just find the natural light is so much better than on a Kindle, which is usually where I'm reading. But I would love just sitting outside and having enough time outside to read for an hour.
And I already mentioned my terrace, yes.
I have a really nice chair in my office in Brooklyn, and 2 bookshelves next to it. That's my absolute favorite place. But airplanes, too, are really good.
Last one. Favorite book that you would never tell anyone that you liked?
I'm not dodging the question. I can't think of a favorite book that I wouldn't tell anyone. I realize that sounds evasive, but I'm actually being sincere.
Matthew McConaughey's recent memoir.
I'm not sure. I have to reevaluate our friendship, Pico.
I went through a phase of reading many Lee Child books, and I can't remember any of them, but I enjoyed it.
Any Lee Child fans out there? Oh, there. You're in good company. Right, the second recommendation then, and we'll start from Emily again.
Okay, sure. My second recommendation is a novel called A Visit from the Goon Squad, which came out in, I want to say 2011, 2010, it was around then, by Jennifer Egan. The thing that draws me to it, partly just that she's an extraordinary writer. I think part of why I have a hard time with the genre question is, for me, it comes down to character development. Whether you're calling it science fiction or historical fiction or, whatever it is. If I care about the characters, I'll follow you anywhere, as a reader. And she just does, she's really good with characters. They're fascinating. What really draws me to this book, though, is that as a writer, I very much enjoy writing books with wildly complicated, non-linear structures and multiple points of view. I like moving all over the place in time in kind of a fragmentary way. And if you think my books are complicated that way, hers, Visit from the Goon Squad, is like that times 10. It's kind of incredible. It was marketed in some countries as a short story collection. That's how wild the structure is. And you could argue it either way. Perhaps the most moving chapter of the book is written in PowerPoint. It is just such a strange, extraordinary novel. In terms of a plot, it revolves around a cast of characters connected to a record producer named Benny Salazar and or his assistant Sasha, who's a bit of a kleptomaniac. They're both fascinating characters. You move from the music scene in San Francisco in the 1970s to this vaguely dystopian future way out in the California desert. The title is kind of amazing. It sounds a bit abstract when you hear it, A Visit from the Goon Squad. And it doesn't snap into focus until fairly far into the book, where somebody says something along the lines of, well, you always said time is a goon. And I love that. We're all visited by the goon squad and roughed up, as time goes on. So yeah, it's one of my favorite books, and it's inspirational to me as a novelist.
Since we're in Asia, I thought I should choose one novel from here. And Rohinton Mysteries, A Fine Balance is the one I'll never forget reading. Many of you know it's the story of 4 people of very different kinds struggling to survive on the streets of Bombay in the 1970s as Indira Gandhi applies her emergency. And I think it's the one epic novel of my time that belongs for me with Dickens or Hardy or Victor Hugo or Balzac. A lot of people in India fault its author, Rohinton Mistry, on the grounds that he doesn't know, he's not up to date with India because for more than 50 years he's been living in Toronto. But I think it's the fact that he's been living in Toronto for more than 50 years that allows him to see his boyhood in Bombay in the 1960s with absolute roundedness and clarity, undistracted by the many changes in that city and that country. And it forms a whole in his imagination and therefore in his literary universe. I was so happy when Oprah Winfrey chose so many good books for her book club, and that was one of them, introducing it to millions. And then the last little thing I'll say is that for me, one of the happiest developments of my reading life is that in the last 40 years, we all know so much of the best writing in English literature doesn't come from England or the US. It's coming from Hong Kong and India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Japan and Nigeria and the Caribbean and Canada. And I think it's thrown open the doors and windows of our imagination and literature to admit new stories, new ways of telling stories, new rhythms. And I think literature is much more interesting now than when I spent 8 years studying it.
So for my next book, and those two were excellent books, I think, and choices. I picked Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, which was a book that was released again in the early 60s and really launched America down a different path. It was banned in many states. It was banned in Texas until 2003. Emily and I were talking, it might get banned again for totally different reasons because of the way people might interpret it these days, but it really challenged what churches were in religion at the time, and really sort of encouraged free love and kind of a whole different way of thinking about society. Because a Martian comes, well, sort of essentially someone born on Mars comes to the Earth and sees Earth from a different perspective. And that sort of reinventing the Earth and how it should operate. And this one person comes and really changes everything that's there in terms of the norms of society. The original edition was written as something like 900 pages, but it was cut down by the editor to about 500 or something like that. Heinlein's widow in 1991 re-released the whole 900 pages. So I think I haven't reread the book, but I think when I reread it, I'll read the longer version. But there are a few books I think that have changed the world so much.
You just sold me on it. I'm really keen to read it.
Have you read it, Emily?
I haven't. Sounds interesting.
Another 3 questions before we get into your last recommendation. Flagrant acts. Yes or no? Dog ear books, I mean. What do you think of dog earing books?
I always dog-eared books until probably about 5 years ago. So I don't do it now, but I don't judge you if you do.
Yeah, I'm all for it. It's a sign of love. You're caressing the book.
I think people should do whatever they want with their books and just enjoy them if that's part of it.
Oh, okay. Well, that sort of takes off for the other questions. So we'll just move on to the next one. What are your next recommendations, please? And we'll start from Jim this time. your last one.
Yeah, I mean, my last book, I've always liked John Fowles. I think he only wrote about 6 books. They're all very good, arguably some better than others. But I'm going to focus on The Magus, which is a book that's somehow stuck in my mind. Again, it's a Second World War, I guess, reflection to some extent. There's an English teacher of English who goes to a Greek island, and he's told not to go to this place called the waiting room because it's dangerous by a friend. But he goes there to teach English, and there were no women on the island except one named Lily, who entices him to go into this house. And in this house, there's essentially a psychologist doing kind of an psychological experiment, really revisiting the time when the Nazis were there during the war, recently at the time, and tries to understand behavior through these experiments. And what is real and what is imaginary becomes very unclear. And the world is being used kind of as an experiment, as something like almost like out of the Matrix. So it has a bit of a Sea of Tranquility connection, I guess, in terms of the feeling that you don't know what's real and what's not, or what's really going on, and maybe there's like a wizard behind the curtain somewhere orchestrating everything. In the end of the book, he goes back, he's released, someone gets out of this kind of being locked in this experiment and goes back to the UK, very confused. And it is a confusing book. It's not the easiest book to read. Michael Caine, when he finished the movie, he said he didn't know what it was about after he finished. So it's an interesting book, though. I think I liked it just because of the escapism to this Greek island and the fact that you could experiment in this way in such a unique setting, and it was just well executed.
Yeah, I think Jim and I are almost the same age, and I remember The Magus was a must-read when I was growing up and going through college. And I was also remembering, I was talking a minute ago about The Fine Balance. I was reading that on a plane from Bombay to Hong Kong. It was just ripping my heart in 1,000 pieces. So I think you need to be strong emotionally if you're going to take on that book, because it really takes you into the depths of human suffering, which speaks to the one nonfiction book that I would recommend to anybody. Maybe, for me, the most stirring book of the 20th century, non-fictional, that I read. And Jim had earlier pointed out, this interestingly converges with Suite Française, because it's a book called An Interrupted Life by Etty Hillesum. And for those of you who don't know it, she, by the sound of it, was a typical, somewhat confused 20-something in Amsterdam, in love with her therapist, in love with the older widower in whose house she was living, not really without any direction, and somewhat adrift. And then suddenly the Nazis arrive in the 1930s, and overnight, it seems, she rises to a confidence and clarity that a saint would envy. She volunteers to work at a transit camp amidst the dying and the oppressed. She could actually qualify for safety, and her friends all tell her ways that they can protect her and make sure that she's not susceptible to the worst forms of punishment. But she turns away from all of that and essentially volunteers to go with her mother and father and her brother to Auschwitz. And I think the diary that was produced that was published posthumously, which was titled An Interrupted Life, in it, she writes with this extraordinary eloquence and wisdom that we might associate with Archbishop Desmond Tutu or Mother Teresa or whatever, but it's that much more stirring to come from a woman in her 20s who sounds just like most of us in our 20s, if we're lucky enough. And just as she was leaving on the train for Auschwitz, she wrote a postcard and threw it out the window. And 2 weeks later, some workers found it in the fields. And her last published sentence said, "We left the camp singing." And that's the whole spirit of her book. It's an extraordinary affirmation and vision of a much larger kind of moral and spiritual universe at a time when she was facing the worst possible affliction. And she died when she was 29.
That's a hard book to follow. That sounds right.
I'd need a drink after.
Yeah, I think I don't even drink, and I need a drink. The last book I'll recommend is a novel that I was obsessed with when it came out, I believe right before the pandemic. I think it was January or February 2020. It's a novel called Interior Chinatown by the American Charles Yu. And you know, I spoke earlier in talking about A Visit from the Goon Squad, about how I'm inspired by books with nonlinear, interesting forms. I feel like as a writer, Charles is pushing novel writing forward in a very different way, which is that most of this book is written in screenplay format, which sounds insufferable, but I swear it works. It's just the most incredible balancing act. It's a surrealist novel. It's about a man named Willis Wu, who is trapped in a police procedural. And it addresses very serious, very difficult topics. It's about anti-Asian racism in the United States. It's about the way our discourse around racism in the US tends to focus on black versus white, and how reductive that can be, and how it can leave out other people and other experiences, and what it feels like to be outside of the conversation around racism when it is a part of one's daily life. So I found it to be, you know, fascinating in form. It is heartbreaking in a lot of ways. It's an incredibly moving work. It's also somehow hilarious, which I realize sounds bizarre, but that's how good he is as a writer. He uses humor to address a very, very not funny topic. And it's just one of the most impressive novels that I've read in the last few years.
Well, the good news is that all of these books can actually be found in the Hong Kong public libraries. I did a check, and you can get them all in the library, and some of them have been translated into Chinese as well. So you should go and check them out if you can. So let's say you finished reading a very satisfying book. How do you find your next one?
I actually have a list of books to read. It's like a spreadsheet that I put together, and I've been trying to read all the books since 1945, not in any sequential order. So when I finish a book, I take about, within the next day, I pick the next book. I try not to do it ahead of time because I feel like when you're finished a book, you need to sort of digest that and think. And I sometimes alternate between American and Commonwealth or something, or sometimes I read the same writer. But you know, I try to. Sometimes I pick a book I physically have versus a Kindle, but it's a little bit random. But the most important thing is to pick another book, because if you stop, I feel like that you lose that continuity, and it's really important to do the next book because you want to get another story into your head.
I think I just follow intuition. I've given up following reviews, and I don't follow most of my friends. But I have a couple of friends who have such exquisite taste and also probably know and read me so well that they have just a sense of which book is going to speak to me. But otherwise, it's like choosing your next holiday. It's something, if it's rational, I wouldn't trust it.
I love that. I like to choose at random. So I moved recently, and I haven't had time to alphabeticize my books yet in my new apartment. So my books are in random order, which at first I found incredibly unsettling. Like, I like alphabetical so I can find what I'm looking for. But lately I've begun to find it kind of exciting. So like, what I like to do is I finish a book, and then I put it back on the shelf. The book next to it could be anything. You know, totally different genre, way different section of the alphabet. Sometimes I'll just read the book next to the one I just put back. Sometimes I'll look at the shelves and think, I've read the fewest books on that shelf, so I'll grab a book from there. So, yeah, I just jump all over the collection.
I mean, one of the things that Hong Kongers lament is that we aren't a society of readers. Nobody in Hong Kong reads anymore. And I think, in general, because of our lovely devices, people don't read as much as we used to. Where do you see the literary arts headed in this increasingly wide world with these distractions of screens and, worryingly, with AI now threatening to replace human endeavor? Is the reader an endangered species?
No. I think that as a species we crave narrative, and I think that can take different forms. There is incredible writing happening in television. You could think of that as another way to consume stories. but even reading itself, let's not be too scared of our devices. You know, like they have had a negative impact on us in a lot of ways. Personally, my attention span is shorter than I would like it to be, and that's my iPhone's fault, which is to say it's my fault for not having better boundaries with my iPhone. But, you know, a lot of people are reading on their devices, and I think we love stories. I don't think readers will disappear.
You're right, I think there are far fewer readers than there used to be, but I think we're living in a golden age of writers. I think there are more great writers than in any time in my lifetime, and I'm always telling all my friends, read the latest Elizabeth Strout, or the latest from Lauren Groff, or the latest from George Sanders, or Frances Wilson's amazing biography of D.H. Lawrence called Burning Man, or Emma Cline's The Girls, or the new book by Louise Kennedy called Trespassers. I mean, I'm almost drowning in the number of good books, and it came up in the event I was doing last night. I mean, I'm struck that two of the choices that Emily singled out are exactly works of fiction that are using these new forms, Jennifer Egan and Charles Yu, but doing something in words and on the printed page you couldn't quite do in an actual movie or PowerPoint normal presentation. And so I think writing has to be self-conscious about the media that it's competing against, and therefore think ever more rigorously of what you can do on the page that you couldn't do better in any other form, which has a lot to do with inwardness and getting into another person and saving us from the visual sometimes.
Yeah, I think sort of what I find is 10% or so of people read. Like if you look at your friends and talk to them, and that seems like a low number. I wish it was higher than that. Maybe it should be 20 or 30 or 50 or something. But anyway, during COVID, I think more people started reading. I think those 10% of people are super interesting people. It's hard to think of a reader who's not an interesting person. And I think reading just makes you smarter and knowing more and more interesting in many ways. I think the physical nature of books is interesting. I think it's hung around. People still like buying books and reading the physical book. Young people particularly. I think young people like Kindle less than older people do for some reason, which is great. But the Kindle is extraordinary. The fact that you can have a Kindle and read so much from that one device wherever you are, somewhere in Africa or Asia or North America. Wow, I just feel like we've underused that device in terms of the library. A whole library can be on that tiny device, and it's so accessible. I do wish young people would kind of use it more, because I feel like it's strange to me young people like physical books so much, but I like them both also. So anyway, I think reading is here to stay, and if anything, through COVID, growing and continuing to grow.
And a few minutes ago, you were really saying it teaches us attention, which in an age of distraction is probably the single greatest luxury, the most important skill we could have.
What are you reading now, presently?
I'm about to start a new novel, which, this is really embarrassing, but I'm blanking on the name. It's in my backpack in the hotel room. But it's a new book by C. Pam Zhang, who wrote How Much of These Hills is Gold, which it's a strange title, but a beautiful book that came out, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. She's a very interesting young American writer, and I really admire her fiction. So I have an advanced reader's copy of the new novel, which I think, Google the name. She comes out in about 6 months or so. I have high hopes for it.
I just read a book that's also going to come out in September by Lauren Groff called The Vaster Wilds. Just devastated me. I think this is an American classic already. And I'm just emerging sort of bloodied from Cormac McCarthy's 2 recent books. And however pitiless the vision, the prose at some points is so transcendent, almost takes you into a different state of consciousness. And it's an interesting example because it's like music, and you almost are not listening to the absolute nihilism of the vision, but you're responding to something deeper than words can usually touch.
I really enjoyed those books. Someone 89 writing those books, really extraordinary. I did what Emily had suggested, like just picking a book off a shelf. I have kind of a book stack, and sometimes I just, what's next? And I had this book called Blood Tie, which is Mary Lee Settle. She's a writer from the South in America, but she lived in England for a long time and also spent a lot of time in Turkey. And this story, she's probably underread. I noticed on Goodreads, there's no Kindle version of it, so I'm reading the physical copy. I think on Goodreads there's 100 people have read it, I guess, in the world recently. And it's about a town in Turkey or on the coast, which has a lot of archaeological digs, and about the tourists that go there to spend time there, and the locals and how they interact. And some bad things happen, but her character development is quite extraordinary. It's kind of I really love Iris Murdoch, and she has usually about 8 characters that get together in a book and do some things together, and that's that sort of book. But it's a mix of these Turkish characters with the tourists from England and America. And it's a great book. I feel strange reading it because I know probably right now in the world I'm the only one reading it. I kind of like that. It's unusual.
Well, I think we've all had some great book recommendations. And before I turn it over to questions, can we give a round of applause to Emily, Pico, and Jim? Now, we'll open the floor to questions.
Hi. Firstly, great recommendations. I'm so excited to
Hold
read.
on 1 second.
Okay.
This mic is a bit dodgy. So share that one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to check out those recommendations. My question is that I think we've all read books that kind of bring us moments of epiphany, and we may have these realizations about our own lives, and we're making these connections. I was wondering, after a particularly satisfying book, what is your post-reading process? I feel like sometimes I want to stay with the book and savor it before moving on, but is there any way in which that book's themes might further stay in your mind through certain practices? I'm curious from everyone.
Yeah, I was gonna, quite often what I do is I watch the authors on YouTube. Like I watch their descriptions of the book. I read reviews of the book, maybe some of the comments on Goodreads. We're blessed with all these different perspectives on a book. So, for example, the books by Cormac McCarthy, there were a lot of mixed reviews on those books. I really enjoyed, and I almost thought he was the only person who could have written something like that. So they were very special for me. But I enjoyed all the perspectives. So I just listening to those, watching those. Watching the author talk about the book is very, very special. And we have technology these days that allows you to do that, which is something more people should do, I think.
And I think doing what we're doing right now, in other words, talking to one's friends in one's enthusiasm, sharpens one's sense of what one really got out of the book and sifts out exactly what you want to share with other people. So, because I live in Japan, I don't speak Japanese, I don't have many friends to talk to. But I do it in email form, and I have many friends who love books as I do, and so I'll send a very long email. Have you just read the recent Cormac McCarthy? Ideally, they'll send it back, and we'll engage in a conversation. And each time I hear from them, and each time I write to them, I'm actually understanding a little bit more. I used to, as soon as I finished a book, just scribble down notes for myself, which is a good start. But I think scribbling those same notes to a friend opens up an even better chapter.
I find in the immediate aftermath of reading a book that was meaningful to me, I like to just sit for a minute, and just kind of be quiet and think about the book. And then, similar to Pico, I'll text my friends. Have you read such and such a book? I think it's incredible. I'm a huge fan of Lauren Groff too. So it's often a Lauren Groff book. Yeah.
Thank you for all those great suggestions. I was just wondering, do you have any comfort reading? Books or authors you turn to when you're depressed or stressed out, like a particular book or author?
There are books that I've loved that I will never reread because I think they would make me incredibly depressed, where I also really admire Cormac McCarthy. I don't need to read The Road again. Now, that's a book you can read once and you got it. Similarly, Hanya Yanagihara's A Little Life, which is devastating. It's a brilliant book that I really loved. And I would not read it if I were even thinking vaguely about depression. It's, yeah, so there are very dark novels that I just wouldn't revisit. Yeah, just in general or particularly if I were feeling bad.
And I'm not sure, were you asking for comforting novels? So, yeah. Well, I think novels inherently can comfort us by taking us to a different world. When friends of mine are down in the dumps, physically or emotionally, I actually press on them a book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And I'm not a Zen practitioner, but it's a translation of, well, it's a transcription of a Japanese man's talks. And because his English is very simple, the transcriptions read like clear mountain running water. And it's so simple, and it's essentially about how to stay clear-minded and confident in the midst of the turmoil of the world. That again, I think the prose as well as the content calms one down and opens one up.
I was just going to say, back to the previous question, that another thing you can do after finishing is watch the movie or series. That's kind of good to do sometimes, especially, let's say you watched a movie a long time ago, you can then read the book. And you sort of, one reflection also is that when you read a book and you reread it, you only remember the last time you read it. So I'm cautious about rereading because it erases, it's like a tape. You erase the old one. So I'm careful, like some of these books we talked about today. But my sister asked me for her book club, can you suggest some happy books from your list, what you've read, happy books? There are very few literary books that are happy books. I know there's bibliotherapy, and it's interesting what people talk about, but I don't believe that you need to read, that reading a book that has some negatives necessarily makes you sadder. I just feel like in many, maybe it brings you conscious that everyone has challenges. This happy romance or happy whatever it is not the way life usually is. Life has all kinds of challenges, so you should just embrace it and see how people get through it, and maybe that might make you feel better, I think, to some extent.